Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Hope everybody's doing well and know you have a lot of important work going on. So really excited that you've taken the time to carve out this part of the afternoon with us. And we hope to provide you with some really good tactics and strategies to use at your schools in light of this situation that is impacting all of us individually, collectively, and each of our schools differently. So we hope you find this valuable. We encourage you to make this more of a discussion. We've got a chat feature here. We'll be monitoring that. So as you have questions or comments throughout, please fire away at the chat function there. We do have a large group, so we'll probably primarily use the chat function, but feel free to unmute yourself and chime in, or maybe we'll ask you to do that as well. And look forward to this conversation. We just diving in, I want to give a quick intro to our lovely presenters here. We have two incredible presenters here, Jennifer and John. I am merely carrying their bags today. By way of introduction, I'm Natalie Skinner. I'm a corporate vice president with CCS Fundraising. If you're not familiar with CCS, we work with nonprofits across all sectors in specifically campaigns, feasibility studies, and assessments. We are headquartered in New York. We've got offices across the country and some presence in Europe as well. For me in particular, I've done the most work in the education sector with schools. So really looking forward to this conversation today with all of you fabulous charter school leaders. Far more importantly is Jennifer Devon, also with CCS. She's a senior director with us. She's been an invaluable resource for us and has a lot of expertise in education, healthcare, and human service organizations. And before CCS, Jennifer helped direct a $140 million campaign for the Archdiocese of Baltimore. She ran the annual fund at St. Agnes Hospital Foundation, and she served as the executive director at Midtown Academy, Baltimore's first charter school. So really excited to have Jennifer with us. And last but certainly not least is John Campbell, founder and CEO of FundEd Strategies. He has more than 10 years of development and organizational management experience. Before he started or founded FundEd, he served as the director of advancement for Eagle Academy, a public charter school, the first exclusively early childhood public charter school in DC. And after years in the charter school space, he saw a need and formed FundEd Strategies to support charter schools, education nonprofits, small and mid-sized organizations to start, scale, and sustain their fundraising programs. He is truly an expert in the charter school fundraising space, and it's a pleasure to be partnering with you, John, on this call. And we have a rogue highlighter on our slide here. Just disregard that. Just adding a little flavor to the conversation. So moving on to the next slide here. Really what we want to do today is share some COVID-19 observations and recommendations on a broader scale. We're going to dive into the charter school landscape specifically. We're going to talk about some tactics for best practices for messaging, for events, for requesting gifts right now. And then we're going to talk about planning, both for June 30th, how to get there effectively, and for FY21. We have some time at the end for questions and discussion, but as I said, please use the chat function and pepper us with questions as we go. We'd love to hear from you. So our next slide here shows some pressing questions that may be on your mind. We've been hearing these from all kinds of organizations, from schools, and from charter schools specifically. And some of those include, how do we ask for gifts in this environment? How do we message this? How do we talk to our stakeholders? What are solutions if government fundraising or funding decreases? And how do we meet our goals without getting together in person, without events, without travel, et cetera? How do we manage projects that are already underway? And how can we possibly plan for next year when we have no idea what's going to happen? So we hope to answer all of these questions and more as we go through this. But again, keep asking us questions as we go. And my last slide before I turn it over to the real experts, wanted to share some timeless principles for fundraising. You know, we've been through crises before, most recently coming out of 9/11, 08, 09, but nothing quite like this. It's different. There's no blueprint. We're all in this together and figuring it out as we go. But there are principles for fundraising that still apply and can help guide us as we navigate this really challenging time.
Did you eat something?
And just a quick reminder to go on mute if you can. So really, the first two here are about communication. You know, we have a human tendency maybe to sort of shy away, bury our head in the sand and wait for a crisis to pass. We need to do the opposite. We need to accelerate our communication with donors and stakeholders. And we're seeing people respond really positively to our outreach. Many are saying, how can we help? And along the lines of how they can help, you can communicate the financial impact of the situation on your school. So do your best to strike the balance of being transparent, not sounding overly desperate, but sharing the increased impact that donors can make in this time. Some schools are promoting special emergency funds that are having success. Others are leaning into annual fundraising appeals and sharing the heightened impact of annual fund dollars. And what we're seeing is donors who can give at this time want to give, especially as they know how much of a difference it makes to organizations that they care about, such as your school. Also, avoid wholesale canceling of fundraising plans, but rather look for opportunities to either postpone or even better to pivot your strategies and use some virtual methods, which we'll talk about in a minute. Of course, it all starts with a plan. So put your short-term and long-term plan down on paper. And the situation is rapidly evolving. So keep going back to your plan and adjusting as needed. We'll talk about how to do that. And now is the time to reaffirm your school's mission, reaffirm the impact you're making, and motivate your stakeholders by sharing good news. So share the good news of the school's ability to pivot and support students at this time. The good news of other donors giving in this time, despite challenges, and your confidence in moving forward with the support of the community. And last, but really should be listed first, is to lead with empathy, compassion, and concern for your stakeholders in this time that is impacting all of us differently and in many cases profoundly. So now I'm pleased to turn it over to John to get into the charter school landscape and specific fundraising tactics. John, over to you.
Great, thanks Natalie. I really appreciate you and the CCS fundraising team for inviting me to join today to really talk about how charter schools can reimagine their fundraising. As Natalie mentioned, I've been working with public charter schools in DC and across the country for several years now. And through that work, I've had the opportunity to really see firsthand how charter school, the landscape is changing, or really what it looks like, more specifically, how schools are responding and how funders are responding during a time of COVID. And so I'm gonna try to walk through that a little bit over the next couple of slides to give you an overview of kind of what we see in DC, where a lot of my work is, and then also what challenges and opportunities exist in this time. So if you could go to the next slide. So first, I think it's helpful just to kind of get some historic data to really get context of what challenges and opportunities might be coming up in the months and year ahead. So at the beginning of 2020, I actually worked with a number of charters in DC to conduct an analysis of philanthropic giving. And this analysis you can find on our website. It's a little bit more detailed there, but this is a really high level overview. What we really wanted to know is not only what sources of revenue our charter schools were seeing, but also really digging down into that individual giving, because it's something that's really hard to find. And a lot of times charters are asking, where do we start? Where do we find funding? And so what we learned from this survey and these results is that competitive government and foundation grants really make up a bulk of philanthropic support for public charter schools. That shouldn't be a surprise to most of the people on this call. And this is in addition to the formula-based grants or the per pupil dollar. So these are just competitive opportunities that exist. What we also saw is that individual giving presents a really unique opportunity for schools to kind of refocus their fundraising efforts. Especially when we look at the return on investment for board members, major gifts, and even parent and family members. In fact, I think some of the most surprising data, especially for Title I schools, is the level at which parents and family members supported their schools. Oftentimes, school leaders are uncomfortable asking parents to support their work, and yet it's a great opportunity for us to create community. And we see a lot of Title I schools getting parent participation between 50 and 60%. And certainly that can be even higher for non-Title I schools. And so just keep that in mind as you're kind of planning over the next couple of months. We also saw that the average philanthropic support per pupil in DC is about $900. And while this can certainly vary from city to city and state to state, and even school to school, it's a really great way to benchmark for future planning, because that's been pretty consistent over the last couple of years. And then finally, we know that a lot of schools have planned events, and it's really challenging. And although they take up a small portion of philanthropic support, they really can be, this can be a time for us to reevaluate what events look like and how they're expected out, what are those expected outcomes that we're seeing. So at the end of the day, I think this data really shows that a diversified approach to fundraising really should be, should help schools kind of think through these challenges over the next couple of months. If we look at all these different revenue sources, that's how we get through this, by pivoting and investing where our ROI is highest. So if you can go to the next slide. So challenges. I think this list could be, pages and pages long. And I think school leaders and fundraisers and nonprofit managers, you could easily add to this list. But these are some of the challenges that I've experienced and that we've talked through with our friends at CCS Fundraising, that charter schools are really experiencing. We know that there's going to be a new normal in education. And not only that, not only what we're experiencing right now with distance learning, but we don't really know what learning is going to look like in the fall or in the future, and moving forward. And so that creates some uncertainty, and challenges for adapting and hiring and added expenses. We also don't really know what's going to be happening with government funding. We typically see reductions in education funding during times of economic instability. And really without federal interventions, states are going to have to slash education budgets. And that's unfortunate, but it is something that we have seen historically. In fact, I've already heard from charter schools in Georgia that are planning to cut 14% of their per pupil funding, in Colorado between 10 and 15%, and here in DC, we're looking at between 1 and 3% of their per pupil dollars. And given that that's where schools get the majority of their support, that means philanthropy is going to play an even bigger role in helping to close that gap, and why we need to focus on growing this piece of the pie moving forward. And I had alluded to this earlier, but schools are spending an immense amount of money on expenses related to COVID-19. And while it's sometimes hard to categorize that, anything associated with distance learning and access to devices, or replacing devices that are likely not going to come back, whether that's training staff to transition, whether that's hiring staff who might be able to work virtually, whether it's purchasing PPE for the new school year, right? These are real expenses that we have to be thinking about, and will ultimately be added into our budgets. And so that's something that might be an opportunity for us to focus our asks and our efforts on philanthropy moving forward. We're all in the midst of planning, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later on, but our budgets are right around the corner, and some of you have already probably have proposed budgets to your boards or your authorizers. And we really need to think about how are we making decisions that are still delivering on our mission critical activities in the face of reduced revenue and increased expenses. And then finally, what are our donors going through? I heard on another webinar that I attended that I really thought was powerful is we might not be all in the same boat, but we are definitely all in the same storm, right? We're all weathering this together, but some of us have started in different places. And, for many of our families, that boat looks different than many of our donors. But I think we also need to think about meeting people where they're at and really getting to know where our donors are, where our parents are, and not making assumptions. And so this is a challenge that is going to continue to present itself, not just now, but over the months and potentially years ahead. And so just keeping that in mind, that this is an individualized approach that we need to move forward. So you can go to the next slide. And so now that we've gotten all the dark and gloom out of the way of the challenges, I really want to shed some light on some of the opportunities that we're seeing, moving forward. We see this as an opportunity for schools to elevate their brand. I mean, ask yourselves, how are you staying on the minds of your donors? How are you articulating your mission? What is your case for support? Those are questions that you should be asking yourself right now, because now more than ever is the saying that I think I've been using for quite some time, but it's true. Now more than ever, education matters, and everybody is a teacher. If you have kids at home, parents are now teachers. And so how are we making sure that we're elevating our brand during that process? Use this time to build stronger relationships. You're home, I'm home, we're all home, and donors are more likely to answer calls, respond to emails, and really want to engage. And so use this as an opportunity to build those critical relationships, whether you're asking for a gift now or building and stewarding for a future gift. Consider, we talk a lot about events, but consider pivoting your events to virtual or investing, in major gift relationships, right? This is something that we really need to re-examine. Again, a lot of schools have had galas planned this spring or have the idea of doing anniversary events this year or next year. And we really need to get down, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, of what is the real purpose of doing these events. But this is a real opportunity for us to kind of think about, what's the ROI? Can we move to individual giving? Can we move to corporate, gifts? What's that look like? And then finally, building a culture of philanthropy. And we talk about this. I think culture of philanthropy is such an industry term that a lot of fundraising people throw around, but I also really believe that it's super important. We now have the time to invest in our infrastructure, to invest in our cases for support. Charter schools were designed to do more with less. But when less means a reduction in mission critical activities, like we have to think about, what is the case for support that we are making to donors, and how do we articulate that? So I think this is a great opportunity for us to dust off those cases for support if it's been sitting on a shelf, and re-examine what we're communicating to donors. And if you don't have a case for support, it doesn't matter. You can actually go and start one, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But right now is a great time to think about how we're communicating to donors and what those asks are and why your work is so important. And so finally, before we jump into kind of some of the best practices, we really would love to hear from you. So if you can take the next 30 seconds or a minute and chat in what you're seeing in the charter landscape, we'd love to hear your thoughts from wherever you are in the country. And I'll read some of them as they come in. And if you're experiencing specific challenges to your school, feel free to share those as well. I think that'll be helpful as we think about sharing out best practices and our response to things. And so as those come in, I think we just had somebody, we have an annual fall auction that always performs well each year. I'm trying to figure out how to plan that. I'll provide an example in our events discussion about pivoting those types of events. In LA over here, lots of concern over government funding cuts and the digital divide. But we do see an opportunity to build stronger relationships with donors that help us finally close the digital divide. I think that's something that we're seeing here in DC and across the country. We've raised $2 million here in DC to help close that digital divide through both and across both sectors. And so I think that's something that's super exciting. Everybody is holding their breath. I think that's probably true. And wondering what the next school year will look like. It's really hard to develop a plan with so many unknowns. I think that's something that we hear a lot from schools, and even as consultants. And I'm sure Jennifer or Natalie would agree. It's like it's tough for us, right? I think what we can do is look at what works, what has always worked, and this is a great opportunity for us to be innovative and think of new things and think about ways to pivot and change some of our maybe bad habits when it comes to fundraising. So I appreciate that. Somebody shared in DC, we're coming to grips with the idea that we need to have a model that is inherently flexible, interested in the way that schools and LEAs are planning for budget implications and thus fundraising. So thanks. There's a bunch, so feel free to read the rest of the comments in the chat, but I think this is a really great example of how schools are kind of weathering this storm and where their questions are, and we'll definitely make sure that we try to touch on some of those points throughout the rest of the presentation. So you can go to the next slide. So we're gonna dig a little bit into capitalizing on the opportunities and also minimizing the challenges. I mean, that's really what we're trying to do right now. There isn't a perfect solution, but we're gonna try to give you the best practices that we have. And we know that messaging, events, gift requests, these each could be an individual webinar on their own, but we're gonna try to give you some high level thinking, some very quick usable best practices, and then help you think about what planning looks like. And definitely reach out to either myself or CCS Fundraising if you wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this. You can go to the next slide. So crafting appropriate messaging and determining solicitation timeline for each constituency. We included this in here because it's really a great opportunity for us to craft messages that meet our donors where they are. We've laid out kind of a 3-message response for you to implement. Your first outreach to your donors, and some of you may have already gone down this road. I hope some of you have already started to reach out to your donors, but if you haven't, it's not too late. Your first reach really should be coming from a place of empathy. We care about our donors just like we care about our students, our families, our parents, our teachers, our staff. So we should check in with them, ask them how they're doing. And then those responses really give you insight into how this pandemic is personally impacting your donors. And so that's helpful when we think about what our message looks like for the second message and future communications. Your second outreach should really be informative and responsive. So let your donors now know how your school has already responded to the crisis and provide them with examples of what you've done and maybe some success stories. I love to see success stories about distance learning or celebrating graduations or delivering food. I mean, schools are community hubs and you're doing so many things. Shout it from the rooftop and share those success stories with your donors, but also be transparent about like, what are the needs? What do you need to continue this work and fill these gaps? And then finally, your third outreach should really focus on the impact, the need, and a call to action. You're likely already seeing results from distance learning. So again, share those stories, but let them know what you're going to need to fill those gaps. Will you need to replenish devices that might not have gotten returned? Will you need to purchase PPE for the start of the school year? Will you need to train all of your teachers again and best practices on distance learning? Those things are expensive and things that we may not have the resources to do, but it's really important right now, and donors are responding to direct, transparent asks. So don't be afraid to ask for what you need, and donors are often stepping up to the plate. I also include in here, include non-financial ways that they can support your work. So it's not just about the gift, and I know from fundraisers that's oftentimes our first go-to, but it's also ways that they can support the mission of the school, because that creates stronger relationships that you can then leverage in the future. And then, as always, remember, acknowledge the uncertainty, but express a need for leadership and broad support. Remember you're contacting people who already are invested in your success. These are people who care about your work, whether they're donors or parents or board members, or all of the above. They are invested in seeing this school successful. And then don't make decisions for donors. I mentioned earlier that we might not be all in the same boat, but we're definitely all in the same storm. And so let's not make assumptions for where people are. And I bet you some of your donors may surprise you. And so just keep that top of mind. Next slide, please. Events. It's a question that I think this spring I got asked a lot. And a lot of people, I think even for myself, it took a second to step back, see what was happening, and really figure it out. And this is something that still is changing daily. Right now, it's likely that we're probably not going to see in-person events for the remainder or most of 2020. And that if you have an event that you're thinking about putting on, either consider pivoting it to virtual or moving it to 2021 at some point. And again, constantly look at your state regulations, constantly look at the CDC recommendations. Make sure that you're making a decision that respects, the health and safety of not only you, but your donors and attendees. But I say that because I think we're all thinking about that already, and we all kind of have that in the back of our minds. I think when we think about whether events can be pivoted to virtual, I have some examples here and some questions. And there are 3 questions that I typically ask, whether it's a board that I'm serving on or a client that's thinking about pivoting an event. What is the intended purpose of the event, and what else can you be doing with your time? What's the outcome? Is this a fundraiser? Is this a fundraiser? Were you just trying to acknowledge donors? Were you trying to identify new donors? Is this a way for us to deliver services? Are you doing, a meal delivery to students? Is this a way to build community awareness? Because understanding the outcome of the event is super helpful at understanding whether you pivot it or postpone it. And so, there was a school that I serve on the board of trustees for, Capital City Public Charter School here in DC. They are celebrating their 20th anniversary this fall, and had a gala planned, and that is now being moved to next year. And the reason that they moved it and decided not to go virtual is because building community and bringing people together for the first time after 20 years is so important to them that it's more important than the actual dollars raised. But if you are used to hosting an annual gala and the biggest outcome from that is we need to raise dollars to close our philanthropic, our budget, then we need to think about pivoting. And so keep that in mind. And then also think about what are your measures of success? Again, dollars raised, who you acknowledge, number of people that attend that you can then follow up with. There's so many different ways that you can measure success, but going into this helps, in thinking about this in the early stages, helps you be prepared. And then finally, does the tone of the event make sense right now? And I add this because, are you thinking about launching a building campaign this summer at an event? Might not be the best ask and might not be the best tone. So thinking about ways that if you are doing an event, that the ask is tied to what's going on. And I have some examples of virtual events, as well as I'll give you some examples of what schools are doing and what we're seeing, because I think that's really what's most powerful to school leaders. But as you think about the types of virtual events to consider, think about whether it's an identification event, whether it's a solicitation event, stewardship, or cultivation. There are so many types of events, and certainly think about trivia nights or talent shows I've seen. Town halls and expert-led discussions, I think, are extremely interesting and don't have to be COVID related. Small group virtual dinners or happy hours or coffees, and distance learning. And we'll share an example in just a second about how we're seeing in leveraging that. And so I know it's a little small on the PowerPoint, but there are 3 examples that I think really speak to this. So Thurgood Marshall Academy has an annual gala, and they pivoted it to virtual. In fact, I believe it is this evening that they're doing a virtual student showcase. And they have a suggested donation and a soft and event ask. They are not setting a fund the need goal. They're just making it, hey, we have this, here's what we are trying to raise money for. Will you support us? And through their planning and what they've seen from sponsorships and individual contributions, they are already planning for a 50% reduction in revenue. Now that is a lot of money that they are expecting to lose. But on the flip side, they are expecting an 80% reduction in expenses, and in fact plan a higher net income. So meaning that they will bring more cash into the door this year than they have in previous galas that were in person, because their gala is costly to put on. So think about not just both the revenue side and the impacts to revenue, but also think about the impacts to expenses when you're putting these events on. Two Rivers Public Charter School here in DC actually just last Friday launched a 1-week silent auction and invited donors to a closing toast at its conclusion, which is tomorrow night. And I'm super excited to attend and see, you know, people on Zoom kind of get together and celebrate the closing of the silent auction. So I know somebody in the chat earlier had mentioned, you know, we have a big silent auction that we do and we're not sure how to pivot it. Well, this might be a really interesting way. They did this online, and we don't have any financial data yet, but I think some of the really cool experiences that they were providing, whether it was classroom experiences for when we do return to some sort of normalcy, or you know, social emotional support for teachers. You know, that when we are able to leave our homes, teachers and mental health is going to be a big conversation, both for teachers and our students. And so is there a way that we can create auction items, if you will, in our silent auctions that are also fulfilling our mission? KIPP DC canceled their KIPP prom. So for those in DC, this is a big event. And it was really sad. I was looking forward to attending. But in response, they launched an emergency relief campaign for alumni and raised over $262,000 in 6 weeks. And that really goes directly to support alumni of KIPP and those that are in college. And so that, I think, is the power of your donors are ready and willing to support your work. You just have to give them a reason to. And then finally, I had mentioned some distance learning and virtual school tours. And I think the school tour is certainly the bread and butter for recruitment and donor relationships. You know, getting people into your school building is so powerful. I saw this when I worked at a public charter school, and you just saw the faces when they met the kids and they saw the learning. That's really hard right now. And it might not be something that we can do until spring of next year. But what we're doing with Focus, which is an advocacy organization here in DC, they've pivoted what they were First Friday school tours, where they hosted with a local school and some funding partners. They pivoted to virtual. And so now funders have the opportunity to kind of pop in. I mean, it's planned, so it's not really unknown, but they're popping in on these distance learning lessons that, as somebody who has attended, is extremely powerful. You can see how these schools are really stepping up to the plate. And if your school has some really amazing stories with that, let's try to think about some distance learning and use the digital tools that we have to get funders into your school, if you will. If you want to go to the next slide.
John, actually, before we move to the next slide, I'd love to invite S. Perkins to unmute, tell us your first name, and talk a little bit about your gala that you shifted to an online gala, and it was extremely successful.
Hi, yes. So actually, I don't normally plan the gala. It's normally parents and our COO. But I believe that we just shifted to an online gala. We had the silent auction leading up to the gala, which occurred last Saturday. So parents had time to place, I guess, their bids on the silent auction. And then right after the silent auction closed at 8:30 on Saturday night, the live auction occurred. And I believe that people were able to Zoom in, and some had their cameras on, some did not. Some couples ate dinner together. So I heard that was very nice as well. So, and I think we raised a pretty good significant amount of money. So that was great. We had already planned, we always have a live auction anyway, and a silent one. So we had already planned it all, and they just shifted it, the parents.
Fantastic. Congratulations, and thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. It's great to see your face, and I hope to see you tomorrow at our community of practice. So if you want, great, next slide, it's already up. So virtual gift requests. I think obviously most of the time right now, school fundraisers are spending time stewarding and cultivating and pivoting and communicating. You know, we're doing all of these things to build relationships and to communicate with teachers or even our parents in our community, and it can be frantic and take a lot of our time, but that doesn't mean that we can't also be soliciting gifts during this time. And I think that's really important, that those organizations that stopped fundraising during the 2008 recession actually found it extremely difficult to restart their fundraising programs. And it took them years to get back to where they were before the recession. And so I think it's sometimes scary, but it goes back to building those relationships and thinking about soliciting. And so to help you think through kind of what that might look like and what a gift request might look like, we've put together some helpful guidelines for scheduling the visit, kind of an outline of the conversation that you might go through, and an example of what to say when you're making the ask. You could obviously feel free to massage these and edit these and make them fit your mission, but I know that having been a fundraiser and a development leader in a school, the more template language that I can get, the easier it is for me to actually implement, because we know that you are pulled in so many different directions, and that development usually isn't the only hat you're wearing. So we wanted to share these with you. And then, much like your in-person gift requests, you really want to make sure that you're building rapport with your donors. You want to make sure that you're doing this with empathy, that you're updating them on how your school is responding during the pandemic, and really directly requesting support and showing your appreciation. And remember, listening is still and will always be the most important thing that we can do, whether it's in-person or virtual gift requests. Allow your donor to answer the questions that you're asking, and don't make assumptions and don't fill in that gap. Silence can be awkward, especially for an extrovert like me. And I have to always check myself to say, stop and listen. And I just make sure that we, as fundraisers, we are also really great listeners. And so just keep that in mind. So I would love to hear, we had somebody jump in around events, but, is anybody seeing any success or trying to schedule virtual gift requests? Feel free to throw them in the chat. We'd love to hear it. And then while you do that, since we are running short on time, I'm going to switch it over to Jennifer, who's going to walk through how we can start planning for the next 100 days and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, John. And before I start into planning, we'll go quickly. I wanted to address Kate C. You wrote something in the chat that said, wondering about the trends in terms of expansion. Who are growing? Are we feeling more pressure to keep moving or less inclined to ask funders to support growth? So I think this will probably be the third time you hear this in this presentation. But what we found in times of previous crisis is those that held back saw themselves kind of behind the curve. Now, does that mean you need to go gung-ho and ask everybody for $1 million tomorrow? No, that's not what that means. But it does mean don't stop. We're using a lot of words right now along the lines of adjust and pivot. And I think John, really summed it up. We're all in the same storm. But you shouldn't stop. If you have a vision for your school and you have a plan for your school that includes expansion, you can adjust how you're going to get to that plan, but don't stop. So it's something that I think is really important that we address. And I think, Kate C., you hit it right on the head right now with everybody thinking, where do I live? So that also is an excellent segue into planning. So if you don't mind switching to the next slide, we're going to run through this really briefly. There's 3 areas of focus, and John touched on some of these earlier, so I won't go too deep on them. But really thinking about how are you going to meet your end of the year giving goals? And we can think about it in 3 ways. Learn from your students. We just talked about being pivoting, adjusting. Think about being adaptable. Your students and your teachers had to adapt to a new life. We as development professionals, as executive leadership, we can adapt too. Think about virtual methods. Everything that John just summed up. This is an opportunity for you to help meet your end of the year goal, looking at it through a different lens. Leverage social media. People are gung-ho on social media. If you're not on it right now on your phone, that's a perfect example. We are actively engaging with other humans via social media, and really seek feedback. We ask everyone that we're talking to, how are you doing? What are you feeling? That's one of the very first touch points John said earlier. How are you doing? And feel free to adjust that question as to how are we doing? Do you feel like we're giving you what you need? Think about what can you do between now and the end of June. Let's get a massive push going. Almost like your own mini big campaign between now and the end of June. We've got less than 60 days. What can you do? You can increase your communication
increase your engagement, pick up the phone. That is like a tried and true principle. Pick up the phone. I want to talk to everyone now. I don't know about you guys. I just want to talk to somebody. So I'm picking up the phone all the time. But also, how can you pivot your development team so that everybody's on the same boat? Remember, we're all in this storm, but we want to be on the same boat in the storm, paddling the same direction. Really make sure that your team's on the same boat, focusing on the same things. And then really kind of that last piece, and I think both Jonna and Natalie talked about it, let's shift the way we think about development. Let's shift and say, this is an opportunity for us to share the need, share what's going on in our schools and how important it is to our community, because right now that's what's going to help us get to the end of the year. So focusing on maybe one-time appeals, maybe a special over and above board gift request. Think about asking your board and volunteers to go out into the community and make their own challenges. Go back to using social media, get that challenge going. I actually saw a school in Baltimore did their own board, over and above board gift request, and then also asking their friends in their own networks to do a challenge. I see a question, do you recommend reaching out to new donors to shift to major gift requests? I think that's yes. The answer is yes. But first and foremost, think about where they fall in that donor cycle. We're not, just because we're in crisis, COVID crisis, we're still thinking about where do donors live. You're going to receive, and actually, if you want to switch to the next slide, these segues are perfect. You're going to see, like, how are we going to bring you in? Many schools are getting new donors because people are saying, education is passionate to me. I need to do something for my community. This is how I can do it. So you're getting these new donors in, but maybe they're not as cultivated. So, thinking about how do I get you involved is a great opportunity. But yes, you want to continue to reach out to new donors, share your mission, like John said, build your case, but also continue to think about those people who are tried and true supporters and re-engaging them maybe at a higher level, an additional gift, explaining why that need is there. So thinking about actual planning, like tangible things you can do in the next, 100 days, let's say, as executive leadership, think about what's going on in school. Let's think up here. What does our enrollment look like next year? Are we looking at reserves? Make sure we're looking at that, because that's going to help craft your case. If you know you need to build reserves, that's going to be a pillar, a case element, if you will. And then finally, think about right now, is there going to be additional wraparound services needed for your kids? This is a reality, so how is that going to impact your budget? So after you've taken a 30,000-foot view of your budget, think about fundraising performance. How were you doing in development in the past 3 years? Were you seeing yourself increase and increase? Take a look at what that looks like and say to yourself, okay, we actually got some new donors in, to your point. Yes, we're getting some new donors in. It might be feasible for us to increase our fundraising goal by 5% because we have X many new donors, or perhaps there has been a major gift donor identified through this crisis, through everything that's going on. And think about who is on your donor pipeline that maybe you've reached out to, but they're kind of hanging in the wind and you haven't really engaged them enough. That's an opportunity there. And finally, you want to think strategically about your goals. So you want to, again, think about an increased need with a potential decreased revenue like John talked about. And you really want to communicate heavily with those other teams within the school. Everyone working on the same focus moving forward, especially, community and family engagement offices. Is our communications team working hand in hand with development to make sure that we're communicating the same things to our external partners? If you want to switch to the next slide. And finally, kind of thinking, all right, what do we need to do to get through the rest of 2020? I'm sure there's some people who are like, I'm ready to get there, but let's focus on what we can do now. Breaking it down into 4 areas. Your case, we've talked about the case a lot here. Making sure that you're actively taking stock of what you're doing now so that you can re-articulate that to either new donors, existing donors that you want to re-engage. You want to include language that's really articulating this is difficult for us. It's difficult for our kids. It's difficult for our families. It's difficult for our teachers. But look what we've been able to accomplish. That segues really well into your leadership. Making sure that your board members can articulate what you as the director of development, the ED, whatever spot you live in your school, are your board members able to articulate that message just as well as you can? And also saying, how can we identify new leaders? We need new people to come in. I think someone mentioned that you had a 10-year-old charter school and you've got some kind of founding members rolling off and new members rolling on. This is an opportunity to identify people who find value in education and in charter schools, and really continuing to personalize your outreach. You know, you're looking for new leadership, you want to make it personal to them. And then as we move forward, thinking about those prospects and how are you handling them? For many of you, you might be getting new donors. Does your systems and operations, can they handle new donors? Maybe you put an online giving mechanism on your website for the first time. Are you accurately capturing name, phone number, email, all of those things so that you can keep in contact with these new donors? And really taking a look at, you know, who's in our portfolio, who's in our prospect list, and, you know, who are those current families or possibly alumni that we could reach out to and maybe develop a strategy for them from between now and the end of 2020. You know, that really focuses on how are you going to implement this, and talking about being able to pivot, looking at alternative modes of operation, looking at alternative fundraising efforts, making sure that you know from now until the end of the year, this is what I want to communicate. These are the statistics I feel our community needs to know. And finally, we know that if a crisis can happen once, it can happen again. So making sure you are articulating that in your case when you're talking to leadership and when you're talking to donors about, we want to be ready should this ever happen again, and make sure that we have additional reserves or additional crisis funding in our plan. You can move on to our next slide. So here's just a tangible thing. I think John said we really like when we get things that we can use. So on the right side of our slide here, you'll see kind of a templated gift table. And on the left-hand side is just kind of some steps that we can go through. You're thinking about your fundraising goals. You're thinking about how am I going to get there with trends. You create a table of gifts. You know, okay, I want to raise $1 million. If in order to raise $1 million, I'm going to need to get gifts at this level and move all the way down. And then really evaluate of our staff and our volunteers, is this feasible? Can I reach out to all of these people? Think about the infrastructure. We talked about your systems, your internal systems. Can I handle new donors? Do I have the opportunity to use things like constant contact, or maybe I have a email blast system within my donor database? All those things are important to make your plan work. And then obviously we need to evaluate and reevaluate what our success looks like. So as you'll see, we put our gift table together. We have a general idea of how many gifts we need at different levels. Obviously, this is customizable to you and what your fundraising goal is. And then we are writing down names. You know, wish it into existence. Write those names down. Make sure that you have prioritized it so that your staff and your volunteers can be on the same goal moving forward. Next slide. All right. So I'm just checking our chat here. I think we're up to date, but any other questions? And we really want to open it up for discussion, especially around philanthropy and being adjustable during this time.
And feel free to use the chat function as well as unmute yourself if you want to have a discussion with us. We have answered all of your questions already. You are pros, you know exactly what to do next. That's wonderful. John, I know that you had some questions, just kind of to hear what the landscape is, you know, for the folks on the phone. We've got folks all over the country. Is anything on your mind, kind of what's going on, you know, trend-wise?
Yeah, no, I think Kate asked a question earlier about growth, and I think having charters from across the country on the call is actually helpful, because it's a question that I think every charter is trying to go through. If you are growing and you are expanding your charter, what does that look like right now? Are you opening next year, and is that on track? Are you planning for future years? And I think what we're seeing and what we're hearing is that it's time to continuously invest in our relationships with our funders. But if you don't have a facility secured, then it makes that conversation a little bit harder. And we just don't know what the market's going to look like. So I'm curious if anybody else is actually, experiencing growth. It's something that a lot of charters talk about, and how they're kind of managing it at this time.
Kate, it looks like you're talking, but we can't hear you. 1 minute from Kate. She'll be back. And while we're working on that, thanks to Anne for your questions in the chat. So I posed this to John and Jennifer. How can or should we pivot how we contact sponsors and local businesses? And are there specific categories of businesses who are looking to grow by becoming sponsors?
I think this is a great question, and Jennifer, I'm happy to jump in at any point. But I think, as we think about whether you're pivoting an event or already had an event, if you've already secured those sponsors, great. Let's reach out to them. Let's reconfirm their commitment to whatever you're pivoting to. If you haven't started that solicitation, it's okay. And this is something that took me a little bit of time to get over that anxiety of reaching out in the midst of, what we're seeing economically. But the reality is people are still super eager to support your work. And what I'm seeing, especially from charter schools, is look to your vendors, look to, distance learning platforms, who is out there that is kind of eager to support. And I also think, certainly it varies from state to state or even city to city. If your state has stopped construction as an essential service, you might not want to go to your local developer. But I say that, and in restaurants, although they've taken the brunt of what we're experiencing, many of them are still willing to offer gift cards and incentives because they know that at some point this will be over. And people are super eager to support their local businesses. And so try to find ways that it's mutually beneficial. And I think to add value to this sponsorship conversation, Two Rivers Public Charter School, who I had mentioned earlier, is doing the silent auction. They were supposed to have this event 8 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago, and they had already secured their sponsors. And so what they did is that they actually weekly would send out emails highlighting their sponsors, and not as a sponsor message, but as how that sponsor and that business is actually supporting the community and the school, and shared pictures. And it was so powerful and such a value add to the local business, who might not be open right now, but will be in the back of my mind. And I'm like, oh, I really should visit that coffee shop because they were there when the school needed it and they weren't even open. So think about that as well.
And I would add to that, John, to answer the question of how do we do this, that is an opportunity to engage leadership. That's an opportunity when your board members say to you, okay, John, what should I do? This is your opportunity to say to them, okay, I would like you to reach out to X, Y, and Z companies. You have indicated you have relationships there. Let's either deepen that engagement, or maybe it's an appropriate time to ask for their support. That's I think a tangible way to answer the how do we contact these places.
Thank you, and thanks to Kate for chiming in the chat. Sorry we couldn't hear your lovely voice, but I'll read what you said. So in terms of growth, I do get the idea of reaching out and not stopping our development and relationship work, but curious about whether there's a sense that this is not the right time to start a new school, focus on the students we have, and wondering if there's a sense of priority shifting to supporting people and organizations in crisis rather than investing in something new. Really good question, Kate. Thanks for asking it. John and Jennifer, do you want to start? And I'd also encourage others, if you've got advice too, to chime in the chat.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I know Kate personally. She great, based here in DC. And I think this is a really difficult question. You know, what we're seeing out of the Charter School Growth Fund, which for those of you who've gone through growth and have looked to funders, they're one of the largest in this space outside of Walton. And you know, they are recommending that depending on the stage of construction that you're in is how far along in this campaign you can actually move. I know, Kate, I know your specific situation, but you know, if you haven't started your facility selection, you know, it might be time to kind of set a pause button, if you will, to evaluate what's going to happen with that particular market. I think funders right now are being responsive to direct issues, and we saw this when the Grantmakers for Education actually put out their report a couple of weeks ago that showed of the COVID-related response funds, 7% of those actually were for K-12 education, and then even further into that, we're looking at, they're supporting wraparound supports. They're supporting, food security and housing and things like that. And so they might not be thinking about growth. However, if you've started the conversation with, let's say, Charter School Growth Fund or Walton or, any of the larger funders, it's worth reaching out and saying, like, what are you seeing and what are you hearing? And that goes for any funder that you have, especially institutional funders. They are eager to hear from you just as much as you are eager to hear from them, and use this as an opportunity to have a two-way conversation, because they're going to tell you what they think. They're going to say, you know what, I don't think growth is good right now, or you know what, no, full steam ahead because we're ready to double our investment. I mean, that might be an exaggeration, but they definitely are. I've seen funders step up to the plate and say, what else do you need? Here's 20, here's 30, here's $200,000, to support your efforts now and into the future.
Thanks, John. And just to kind of broadly piggyback off of that, you raise a really good point, Kate, that strategic priorities and the message and where is our focus is really important. We don't want to appear tone deaf, and we don't want to necessarily charge ahead with something we were planning on 6 months ago, but maybe now is not our top priority now. But it really depends on the situation, and I think sharing something that's part of the larger strategic vision that ultimately supports the students is important, and it's just on a case-by-case basis of when exactly to move forward and how to message that, or maybe it is a priority shift in the short term to really respond to the needs and ultimately keeping the students at the forefront. So thank you, everyone, for your incredible participation. This is absolutely fantastic. We love the discussion. We are here for you. If you have additional questions, you have additional thoughts, you want to chat with us offline, please don't hesitate to reach out. We will be distributing these slides and the recording of this session. Please feel free to pass that to your colleagues and your peers. We hope this has been helpful and look forward to continuing the conversation with you. So thanks again, everyone. Continue the conversation and hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.